Well, hello, my fellow millennials, and welcome to another episode of the Millennial Reset, where we're coming together as a generation to do a little bit of healing and growing. And today we're talking about millennials and how our relationships are in kind of this weird time of change. Because, with these changing values and beliefs in our 30s, I think that we really begin to reevaluate our various relationships and put them under the microscope. Things like finally beginning to understand our parents, for better or worse, and some of the conditioning that maybe we've received from them. We begin to crave maybe not more friendships, but deeper friendships. It's the type of friendships where you have like the full permission to just be you and nothing more or less. And our relationship with work changes too, right? It's like you hit this point where it's where the two roads diverge, and either your identity becomes even more strongly tied to work, or we begin to separate the job title from who we are. And I think most importantly here is the relationship with ourselves, where we begin to heal our inner child and start the years long process of reparenting yourself. And the thing is, y'all, you don't know when this is going to start. You don't know why it's going to start. But it's almost like life is kind of challenging you in your 30s to begin to kind of shift your perceptions and perspectives in all of these different areas of your life. So, whether you are in the midst of this right now, or maybe you're just starting to become aware of it and the new person that you're becoming, and maybe you're even feeling a little bit of afraid of the impact that the change that you're experiencing will have on all of your relationships so far. So, if that's you, then this week's episode is for you, millennials and our changing relationships, and how to embrace the growth and the learning that comes from this. If you're new here, I'm your host, Peter Goose, former teacher turned burnt out corporate millennial, until I took about a 2-year break from the hustle to just simply heal. And now I'm taking you along with me for the journey to hold space, to just help us all overcome this burnout and heal our fried nervous systems and decondition together, and do my part as your millennial mindset mentor. And I'm joined today by one of our millennial mental health besties, Lindsay Lopez, who you may remember for those of you that are returning listeners. She was on a previous episode with us, the We Adult So Hard, where we forget how to play, where we talked about the importance of integrating more play into our lives. Lindsay is back again to share more, especially from her perspective and professional experience in child development and what that means for our shifting relationships. So, Lindsay, welcome back. Tell everybody a little bit more about who you are for those listeners that are new here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. What an honor, as always. Welcome to everyone. My name's Lindsay Lopez. I'm really many things. If you listen to the last podcast, we talked about even that millennial kind of diving into wearing lots of different hats and what do I want to be when I grow up? So I'm an occupational therapy professional, public health professional, community health worker, and an infant early childhood mental health consultant. And I currently work in the early childhood world where I support um, statewide early childhood coalitions and professionals with their professional development.
Very nice. Yeah, I was joking with Lindsay last time on the other episode. I'm like, Lindsay, you're such a millennial because you wear like 10 different titles for yourself. But we were like, you know what? That's good. We need to give ourselves more permission to do that. So,
Yeah, and I actually just recently got my yoga teacher certification too. So it's like you just continue to
add
go
one
and
on.
grow. Yeah, and I mean part of it is being a lifelong learner and just
Yeah.
continually seeking more education and diving deeper into things. I have a certification in life coaching, and in my spare time, I do some writing and art as well. So,
Yeah. A little bit of everything.
yeah.
All right, Lindsay, let's dive in to the good stuff today. Lindsay and I were kind of chatting beforehand around like how do we want to structure this, and I'm really excited for y'all to kind of hear some of these insights today. So, before we dive into some of the different relationships that might be shifting for us in our lives, let's start with like the groundwork foundation, right? Is like from a psychological mindset perspective. Lindsay, like, how do you see it? Like, why do you think we're all kind of collectively experiencing this kind of awakening in our 30s where we begin to look at some of those relationships and aspects of our life under a microscope?
During this time in our life, we're actually at a psychological developmental stage where we truly are developing our own sense of the world, an own sense of ourselves and our purpose. With that being said, we're also breaking free from things that we may have been taught and developing our sense of self. So, in our 20s, we lack a lot of insight and judgment and do a lot of crazy fun things.
Never.
Um, exactly. Sometimes I look back and think, wow, I'm glad I'm still
How did
alive.
how did we survive that? Yeah.
Yes. And we're also taking a lot of information in and we're seeking a lot of information. And I think it's that when you're starting to get into your 30s, you're really integrating that information and developing your sense of self. So maybe even thinking a little bit differently than how you were brought up or what you were taught in school and starting to really develop your sense of autonomy and yourself.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, even I can even remember back to like my early 30s. Yeah, there was just like it was almost like a growing voice within me that was like, "Hey, it's time to kind of check back in with yourself over here because you spent the last 30 years of your life pretending to be this kind of conditioned version of you, and now it's almost like this whisper that slowly grows over time in your 30s that's like, "Hey, I'm still in here and I need you to come back to me and figure this other part of
Yeah.
you out." But yeah,
Where's
it's
that little one inside of you saying
yeah.
like, come on back, where am I, who are you?
Yeah, it
and
really
and this
is.
growing voice that's also in fact screaming like, this is not what you want to do, this is not who you want to be.
Yeah.
Pull away from the system. So that definitely was my
Yep.
experience.
So yeah, I mean, I think, you get to that point in your 30s where I think the bottom line is you just begin to know yourself better. And that then influences multiple different relationships and aspects of our lives. And so we're going to kind of break this down like one by one today. And I want to start off with one of the relationships that I think probably changes the most for a lot of us, which is the relationship with our parents. The shifting of needing our parents to get our basic needs met to really beginning to kind of view our parents for who they really are. And obviously, there's a lot of kind of in between space here of our relationships and the quality of our relationships with our parents. But for today, at least, what I want to do with you, Lindsay, is kind of break it apart into kind of two main big groups, at least. And the first one of which is the types of relationships with our parents where we begin to realize, okay, I need to start setting these boundaries. I need to start setting boundaries with maybe the person that I love the most because the inside me, the true me, that loud voice begins to say louder and louder, hey, guess what? You're not honoring your own values and beliefs. And so I guess my question for you today, Lindsay, is any tips that you would have for us when we're thinking about like setting those boundaries with our parents so that we don't get too tied up in their perception, I think is the big thing, right? We get so fearful of, oh my gosh, what are they going to think? What are they going to say in response? What are some ways that either you found successful yourself or working with clients of how we can begin to um, healthfully set those boundaries in ways that their perception of it doesn't affect us as much?
Oh my gosh, that is like the story, the question of the lifetime. How do
Yeah.
you balance love them and be connected to them, um, but not be just completely railroaded by
Mm-hmm.
them, by family in general. So it's like all of them are doing it, so you need to do it too. If you don't do it this way, you don't love us.
Yeah.
If you don't, um, especially I think millennials feel this a lot too, that pressure of if you don't go to college and work hard and get the house by a certain time and have the marriage and the children and hit all of the milestones that our parents did, we're kind of a failure. Or if we've done things a little differently, or if we, God forbid, went to school and got a liberal arts degree,
Uh-huh.
that really probably wouldn't, be in line with some of at least my parents' thinking.
Yeah.
um, these boundaries don't have to be harsh boundaries. Boundaries can kind of fluctuate and ebb and flow and also be gray sometimes, but also enough that you are taking care of yourself and taking care of your mental health. So if
Yeah.
you know that going to Thanksgiving dinner is always a really stressful thing, but I want to be with my family, then what do I have to do to take care of myself beforehand? So is it that I really ask ahead of time? Can we not talk about politics?
Mm-hmm.
Can we set those boundaries ahead of time so we avoid any of the issues that it might, arise because of that? Or having the courageous conversations
Yeah.
is really a key too, of being able to say, hey, mom, hey, dad, hey, auntie, when you say this, it kind of makes me feel like this.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to be direct, clear as kind, um, and really listen to each other. Why do you say, well, it's because of that's how I was raised, and that's how I grew up, and that's how you
Yeah.
should grow do the same. So I think that, the tips that I would have is that we can have boundaries, but sometimes we look at them as walls. And they don't
Mm-hmm.
always have to be harsh boundaries, but keep in the priority your mental health and
Yeah.
taking care of yourself. Yes, you can ebb and flow through those boundaries. And some are going to be harsh boundaries. Some are, this is the line. I am not standing for this. I can't be around that. You have to take care of yourself first and your
Yeah.
mental health first.
Yeah. And I absolutely love what you brought up too about like communicating it in advance because I think, for me at least, it's like sometimes I think about some of those like larger family Thanksgiving dinners and I'm like, well, I'm just not going to go because I know
Yeah.
what's going to happen at those dinners, right? It's going to
Hmm.
turn into a political talk. It's going to turn into arguments, right? And it's like, I'm just not going to go versus where can I begin to still show my family that I love them, but
Hmm.
also being able to set that boundary in advance to say, hey, by the way, I'm coming to Thanksgiving dinner, but I just want you to know that the moment that political talk comes up, I'm out, right? You've
Yep.
given them almost like the
Exactly.
heads up. And I think that's a perfect example of ways that we can hold the line for for ourselves while still being able to show love and compassion for our family members. So I love that.
Absolutely. I think that also plays into I love and respect you, even though you have different opinions.
Yes.
And, you know, maybe it's okay to talk about those different opinions at a different time, but maybe not at family functions.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
So
think it
showing
goes,
the love and respect and being open to different opinions, you don't have to think the same way as I do, but I don't have to think the same way as you do. And it certainly doesn't have to be discussed at a child's birthday party.
yeah, exactly. And I think that really goes into like this other group, right? So there's this kind of like group over here where it's like, okay, I've got to set some boundaries with my parents for my own well-being.
Yes.
But then there's kind of like this other side of things too, where it's like, I think a lot of us in our 30s begin to let go of some of the resentment that maybe we've held on to that says, oh my gosh, I can't believe that my parents raised me in that way. And as long as there wasn't like,
Mm.
big T trauma involved anywhere in
Hmm.
there, right? It's like, I think that a lot of us also get to that place in our 30s where we forgive our parents for not knowing any better, right? And being able to
Hmm.
understand their intentions at the time to say, okay, maybe they were just trying to do the best that they could do at the time with the
Yes.
resources that they had and going kind of down that path of our relationships with our parents changing because of that simple act of just letting go. And I think it goes back to what you were mentioning too, Lindsay, is you don't have to like their way of doing things and vice versa, but can you just respect it anyways? Can you let each other be, even if the other person's not going to change, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I'm glad that you brought up trauma, big T trauma, because I do think that, especially if someone has experienced major trauma with families or major safety issues, that's when a harsh boundary is
Yeah.
absolutely applicable. And you're setting that boundary for not just your mental health, but your physical health and your safety as well. But also, so we start to analyze how we were raised,
Yeah.
and sometimes that comes with blaming the parents, blaming the caregivers. And I can hear many parents saying, you don't need to go to therapy or counseling.
Yeah.
That's nonsense. They're just going to teach you to blame your parents. Oh, it's all my fault. I can
Uh-huh.
hear that playing in my mind. And so by analyzing how you were raised doesn't mean that you're blaming, you're looking back at those formative years, which really developed your sense of self, your self confidence, your interests, who you are. And then when we start to, in your 30s, into your 40s, really analyze that trueness of who you are, you will think, goodness, maybe I react like that because when I was younger, my parents reacted like that in this situation. Or this is a deeper one. Maybe I'm
Mm-hmm.
not comfortable with this feeling, such as sadness, because it wasn't always an easily accepted feeling in my home. And I was sent to my room to cry it out on
Yeah.
my own. And I didn't really have
Yeah.
that support of co-regulation. And so when I feel sad now, I feel uncomfortable. I don't know what to do with
Mm-hmm.
it, or I want to be alone and I want to isolate myself. And so, yes, that does relate back to how we were raised. But we're also not here to blame or shame our parents. Our
Yeah.
parents and our caregivers did the best they could with the information and what tools they had at the time. And
Mm-hmm.
likely their parenting model and what they did as parents were
Yeah.
because of how they were parented.
Uh-huh.
So there is a balance of recognizing those things and learning more about yourself,
Yeah.
but also not blaming or shaming your parents and being able to let go of that. Because if you are at a place where you're having trouble working through something because of something that happened in your childhood, we
Mm-hmm.
have to find healthy ways to be able to let go of that and disconnect as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think bottom line is whether it's setting boundaries, whether it's going to therapy to kind of go through some of that forgiveness and resentment process, whatever it may be, right? I think the bottom line is those that one way or another, your relationship with your parents is without a doubt going to begin shifting, right, in your 30s, and just being okay with it, growing along with it, and
Mm-hmm.
at least for me, it's always looking at what am I learning about myself from this, right? Like that's the question I'm always asking myself, and as long as I can answer that with something, then I know I'm on the right path. Let's shift gears a little bit here. So we've talked about the relationships with our parents, but I think one of the other big shifts that's happening with a lot of millennials right now in our 30s is the relationships with our friends, peers, coworkers. Um, I think that we're going from a model of quantity to quality. We desire deeper, more authentic connections, and I think there's also a piece in this to be said too of like what COVID did to us for our social connections. We had
Yeah.
less of that face-to-face connection, more self-isolation, and so I think a lot of us, including myself, we're kind of coming out of that phase of our lives into our 30s and wanting what we had before COVID back again, those deep connections with our friends, the authenticity. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are around this. And I love what you talked about before. So I'm going to have you talk about the coffee shop
Yeah.
metaphor again. But
Oh, I love
what
it.
are,
I love it
yeah,
because I love coffee too.
yeah, what are some ways that we can kind of integrate more connection, more face-to-face relationships in our daily lives that are low risk?
Yeah. And I think it's important to note before we dive into that too, just even relating. discussion of boundaries or how relationships change. Of course, that can apply to friendships and peer,
Yeah.
co-worker, colleague relationships as well. And what I'm finding now as I'm diving into my 40s is this piece of how some friends come in and out of my life and in and out and back in again,
Mm-hmm.
or out for good. And sometimes it's because of a rupture or a reason, or sometimes it's just because life can disconnected us a bit.
Yeah.
And so I find that that's interesting. And I also love the feeling of when you connect with someone that you've known for a really long time, but maybe you haven't connected for even a couple of years and you pick up right from where you
Best feeling
started.
ever.
It's
Yeah.
so good. That's so good. That's the deep connection that we're seeking, right?
Yeah.
And so I recently saw a picture. A mentor of mine actually posted it, and it said the difference between getting coffee and having coffee. And it had a picture of a bunch of cars lined up at Starbucks. I know we're going to pick on Starbucks, and I'm a faithful Starbucks fan. But, in the line, in your car, in the drive through, just getting your coffee, getting your caffeine fix, moving on for the day, and then a picture of some folks at a cafe sitting down together, really cherishing that time together, really connecting deeply, and really enjoying that coffee. That's why coffee always tastes better when you have those moments like that. But I think that's the difference between the kind of superficial relationships and finding ways to create deeper connection.
Yeah.
And I love what you said also, too. Even that having coffee doesn't always have to be with someone, but rather
Yeah.
even, being around others.
Yeah. That's been like huge for me too. Like I'm very fortunate, I feel like, to have my like very close knit group of friends here in San Diego, but it wasn't always like that by any means. There was a period of my 30s where I was like very just lonely, didn't feel like I had a whole lot of connections. And I still do this today. I will go to a coffee shop, by myself. Maybe I'll get some work done there, or maybe it's just like sitting there with a good book. But there's just something about
Mhm.
the energy of a coffee shop, right? Where it's just like being around other people
Yeah.
that have something as simple as a shared interest in coffee, you know?
Yeah. Isn't that
And
great?
I think the other thing too that I really love about this whole idea of like, getting coffee versus having coffee is, um, this gradual release almost, especially coming out of COVID, because I know for me at least, there was a lot of that social anxiety of, you're telling me I'm just supposed to like go back to the club now? And not that I went to the club in the first place, I shouldn't say that, but you know what I mean? It was
Those
like,
were many years ago.
yeah. But you know what I mean? It's like when we came out of COVID, there was like, it was like, okay, are we just supposed to go back to everyday life now? And there was a lot of
Like
social
turn the light switch
anxiety.
back on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's just another it's also good to think about that in terms of like giving yourself a gradual release, I guess you could say, back into having deeper connections and deeper relationships. It might not be sitting down with somebody and spilling out your whole life story, right? It might be just, hey, go to the grocery store in person instead of getting your groceries delivered on Amazon. Go sit down at a coffee shop for an hour, just so that you're able to feel the connection with human energy around you, right?
You know, I I really think that you hit something about COVID too, because I know that during that time, I got really in touch with my introverted self.
Oh yeah.
And prior to that, I would have described myself as an extrovert.
Hmm.
And now I've realized I'm both. I'm more like an omnivert where I can be very introverted and extroverted, but I need that recovery time to be extroverted.
Yeah.
So I learned more about myself as well, but I think most of us got in touch with that. And
Yeah.
although we missed the social connection and we missed doing those regular things every day, I got really comfortable with just being in my home with just my small family and
Yeah.
just doing my thing. And so I think that that on top of social anxiety and, just even the anxiety of what does it look like to go back out into public and potentially expose myself to being at
Yeah.
risk to getting sick or whatever this may be. It wasn't just as simple as flipping a light switch.
Yeah. And this goes perfectly into one of the next things that we're going to talk about here is like not just the relationships with our parents and the relationships with our friends, but also our shifting relationship with work and with our job. Not only because I think, I think a big part of that was COVID for those of us that were working from home during COVID and then had to go back to the office. That was a huge shift. But I think that there was another maybe more internal shift that was happening within us, like what you were mentioning, is that we were spending so much time by ourselves that we began to maybe rediscover those parts of us that we had forgotten about for all those years. And then going back to work again, it was like, okay, light switch back on, go back to work and have this be the thing that you do all day. And I think it was a big wake up call for so many of us of reevaluating our relationship with work, that stronger desire for more of that balance and less of our identity tied to the job title. So, what are your thoughts on that, Lindsay? Like from a, I guess, I don't know, psychological brain-based perspective or what have you, is like how do we begin for those of us that are still feeling like we're so married to the job title and the work and we want more of that separation? How do we begin to do that? How can we begin to unmarry our identity from the job title?
I think it really takes, again, sitting with yourself, like
Yeah.
the closures allowed us to do. And busyness lends to distraction. It
Hmm.
distracts us from getting to know ourselves, it distracts us from getting to know others, and it distracts us from really feeling the feels too and feeling our emotions. So
Yeah.
busyness really does kind of lend to the distraction, especially the feeling the uncomfortable things. Well, I'm just gonna go clean the closet instead of being sad.
Yeah. And
But oh, go ahead.
I was going to just say, I love what you were talking about too earlier of this whole idea of like we so oftentimes over identify with one part of our
Hmm.
life, like work versus our essence. Talk to listeners a little bit more about
Yeah.
what you mean by that.
Yeah. So sitting with yourself and really analyzing what are the functions of my life versus who am I? What is my true essence?
Hmm.
I think when you're able to tease that out and really identify that, you can begin to understand that the functions of my life, such as being for me a wife, a mother, whatever my job title might be, and all of these roles I have are not me.
Yeah.
I am the me that does those things. And although it's part of me, those are functions of who I am. The real essence of who I am is a visionary, a creative, and so I think that there is a big difference in who I am that does those things
Yeah.
and what my purpose may be surrounding who I am and the functional roles of my life. And over
Hmm.
identifying with any of those roles in our life doesn't lend to us really identifying who we really are, who the true essence of myself is.
Yeah.
And the other thing that can get a little wonky too is if I over identify within those roles and neglect something else in those roles as well. So if I over
Hmm.
identify with my job title, hi, I'm Lindsay, I'm this, versus I'm all of these other things, um, then we neglect other spaces and roles and things in our life too.
Yeah.
So when we ask the question, a lot of meditation prompts will sit down and say, you know, I am, I am powerful, I am, and
Yeah.
affirmations and whatnot. What really are you? And that's what you can really sit with. It's not that you're a principal, you're a fire person, fire rescue person or a
Yeah.
doctor. That's part of who you are. It's a role or a function, but that's not your essence.
Yeah, this was such a huge one for me in my kind of burnout recovery journey too, because when I left my job, I went down to very minimal part-time hours, and all of a sudden, I felt completely lost because I was like, "Who am I when I don't have the job title there?" Right? And it gets back to that whole point of the essence of you versus the functions that you serve on a daily basis. And I think that's what can be so difficult when we talk about like millennials and setting boundaries. It's like, if you're going to set a boundary, you have to know why you're setting the boundary. Yeah, you want more time, right? But like, what are you going to do with that time? And if you don't know what the essence of you is, those things that fill up your cup so that you can do the functions better, right? Like that's the tough part. And so for anybody out there that's feeling like, "Oh my God, I'm so stuck with this. Where do I begin?" I think the tough question that's going to take you some while to sit with that Lindsay was mentioning is, yeah, what's your essence versus what's your function?
Yeah, those can be really deep diving questions that I think you do start to really explore into your late 20s, into your 30s and early 40s. And I think
Yeah.
that that can change too. I think these things can shift just like your job title can shift.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And that, I mean, yeah, everybody get your journals out tonight and start doing the inner work. But I mean, it flows perfectly right into kind of our last bucket here, which is not just the relationship with our parents, not just the relationship with our friends or work, but most importantly, the relationship with ourselves and giving ourselves more of the grace and self compassion to begin to get back in touch with the part of us that got covered up by so long by our conditioning, by the pressures of society. And so, when we think about this whole idea of like, reparenting ourselves and
Mm.
being able to do the tough inner work and some of that self-talk. Um, what are your thoughts, Lindsay? Like, I don't know, one or two things that we could be doing, easy things on a daily basis to get more in touch and be kinder to ourselves so that we make more space for that essence part.
Oh, when we were talking earlier about how our relationships with our parents shift, I was thinking about how, when you mentioned really being dependent on them for our needs and our younger, early childhood and younger years as we grow up, I was thinking about that and how the connection and the attachment that you build, and that relationship that you build is just so critical to your social emotional development. So
Yeah.
when I think about my inner child and I think about that saying of, you know, be the parent to your inner child or yourself that you needed now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly what that looks like, to be
Yeah,
honest with
that
you.
was
I
going to be
think
my
that's,
question. Like, what the hell does that
yeah,
even mean?
I know. It really, what exactly does that look like? And I mean, we can break it down to as simple as like maybe my inner child, maybe the 7-year old me just needed a hug,
Hmm.
just needed some compassion, just needed some love. And so I think if we look at it in that space of, you know, what kind of deep love can I give myself that I
Yeah.
might have needed as a child? Maybe I got that, pretty well, or sometimes, or not at all. But
Hmm.
what do I need now to like go ahead and hug that inner child or hug myself? And the key thing that I talk about, and I try to remind myself of this all the time in changing my mindset, is what would I tell a friend? So, what
Yeah.
would we tell our besties? Instead of being so hard on ourselves all the
Yeah.
time.
And I just had a little aha there too, because one of the other episodes that we were doing a couple of weeks ago was like, we were talking about parenting. And I think one of the things that millennials do a fantastic job of is not allowing that generational trauma to travel down to our kids and our
Mm,
children. And I think about it like that too. It's like, y'all, we're doing such an amazing job of breaking that generational trauma by having the conversations differently with our children. Talk to yourself like you talk to your children. Because I
yeah.
think that we get so busy with our lives. And then when we get home at the end of the day, for those of us that have kids, I do not have kids, so I can't speak to this personally, thank goodness, because I would not be the best parent right now. But for those of us that do have kids, we come home from work and all of our attention and time then goes to our family, to our kids, and not forgetting even in those moments where you have so many responsibilities at home too for your family of like, if you're not taking care of yourself first, how are you going to have the resource to take care of anybody else? RuPaul said it best, right? If you can't love yourself, how you gonna love somebody else? Amen.
Yes, definitely. And truth be told, that capacity really ebbs and flows and fluctuates too, because, some days you just come home from work or
Yeah.
something's happening and you can't like be your best self to your little ones or
Mm-hmm.
whatnot. But I think that really hits home for me too. Not only what would you tell your bestie, but also how would you talk to your little ones?
Yeah. It's
And you
huge.
can't pour from that empty cup, right? So,
Yeah.
how do we take care of ourselves so that we can have more capacity to be more supportive? And let me tell you, being a generational cycle breaker is not for the weak.
Oh yeah, no.
Oh,
Be
I'm
prepared.
telling you, some of my parenting friends and I really talk about that because often, especially in like a reactive state, I have that like really flip of the switch reaction of maybe something my parents would say.
Yeah.
And again, not to blame or shame, but maybe that's not how I want to parent now.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a parenting curriculum called Circle Security, and they tell us, based on research, if you do the right thing, make those decisions in a less reactive manner, connect with the little one, 40% of the time, it's going to benefit that child. And you can be a good enough person and
Interesting.
a good enough parent, right? You don't have to be perfect. So even
Yeah.
if I kind of do lose my shit sometimes, just truth be told, but if 40% of the time I'm really making that effort to connect,
Yeah.
really we can break those generational cycles.
Mm-hmm. And it's just again, it goes back to the same idea, right? It's like you're just becoming aware in that moment, right? That's like, oh, maybe I
Yeah.
didn't say that in the best way to my child. Okay, great. You
Mm,
become aware of that for your communication with your child, but what about the communication with yourself? Are you still
yes.
talking to yourself in that same way? Because if you are, then your brain and your mind is listening. That inner child is listening, right? Whether or not you are aware of it or not, the way that you are talking to yourself is having a direct effect on how you're going to think about the next thing the next day, right? And so,
Yeah.
that's a
Peter, I
whole other
think of
episode, but
it truly is, but I think of the idea of karma. And
yeah.
so the layers of karma deepen as we think something, say, let's just say an example of a negative thought. We think something, and then if we say it, then our level of karma deepens. And then if we act on it, then our
Mm-hmm.
level of karma deepens. But our brain doesn't know the difference between thinking it and doing it or saying it.
Yeah,
And so,
exactly.
if it's that negative self talk that I'm thinking or that I'm saying, our brain doesn't know the difference. And we're telling ourselves the most awful things about ourselves.
Yeah.
So, please give yourself a hug, give yourself some self compassion, tell yourself you love yourself.
Mm-hmm. And I think, the most important part of all of this, I think for me was starting there. When you talk about our changing relationships, it's really hard to change your relationship with work if you have not first changed the relationship with yourself. It's really hard to change your relationship and set those boundaries
Yes,
with your parents, with your friends that
yes,
you love so much, if you haven't started with loving yourself first more, right? And so
absolutely.
for those of you that are listening to this today, like I mentioned before, that are kind of at the beginning stages of this, whatever you want to call it, awakening, healing journey. And, again, maybe there's that fear in the back of your mind that says, oh gosh, what is this going to do to my relationships? It's a process. It's a learning
It
process. It
really
is a
is.
growth process, but it all starts with you, besties. It all starts with you. So, with that said, Lindsay, I know that we were talking earlier about your website and your book that's coming out. And so, before we wrap up this week's episode, share with the viewers where can they learn more about your website and give them a little sneak peek, 30-second overview of your book coming out.
Oh, great. Thank you. So I have a website, Lindsay Dawn Lopez at wixsite.com. You can also find me on at Shining Courageously on Facebook. And I am excitedly working on a book. It's called From Illegal to the Law, and it's a book about my family's journey and story as a migrant family, and just all of the barriers and the beautiful resilience of my husband's journey and his process and our family together.
Yeah. I think, Lindsay, you're just such a perfect example of like this multifacetedness that we talk about so much with millennials. It's like we talk on here on the podcast about like your background in, therapy and child development, but like what you're doing with the book is like this whole other facet of your life. And so I think you're just a perfect example for others out there that are like, well, I can't write a book. I'm not an author, right? It's like, yes, you can. You have a story
Yeah.
to tell. And it is perfectly okay. It goes back to the relationship with yourself, right? It's like
Oh my gosh, yes.
nobody else, their perception of you is none of your damn business. If you know your intention, that's all that matters. So thank you for
Yeah,
being
sometimes,
an
oh,
example.
thank you for letting me share that. And you're right, we are complex and multifaceted millennials that have many beautiful layers and interests and learning and talents and skills. And I think sometimes when we think about stepping into something like as vulnerable as writing a book or maybe doing a podcast or TikToks or videos
Hmm.
or just putting yourself out there, we do feel the fear of being judged or what someone else's perception will be. But let me tell you that everyone has a story inside of them. And
Yeah.
I think we're in the age of wanting to hear each other story tell and learn from each other and connect.
Yes. Exactly. Oh,
Yeah.
so good. Well, besties, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation today as much as I have. Embrace the change, It is 100% perfectly normal and expected for us to change over time, for us to change our identities. And with that comes a shift in our relationships with each other and with ourselves. So be gentle with yourself. Give yourself the grace and compassion that you would give the younger version of you, and
Yes.
be okay with the uncomfortableness that might come along with that. So,
Yes.
thank you all so much for joining in for another episode of the Millennial Reset. If you like what you heard, be sure to follow, subscribe, share with your besties. You can learn more about the podcast and some of my other support resources on the website, www.themillennialreset.com. And I hope to see you next time, besties. Take care.